In April 1985, the most powerful brand on the planet made a decision so catastrophic, so bewildering, that it triggered a national crisis. Not a financial crisis, not a legal one, an emotional one. Thousands of people called a hotline, in tears, to beg a corporation to change its mind. A U.S. senator described it as a threat to American heritage. One man drove 120 miles just to stockpile the old version before it disappeared forever. What did Coca-Cola do? They changed their formula. 99 years of the world's most recognized taste. Gone. Replaced overnight. By their own hands. This is the story of how the world's most successful company convinced itself it needed to fix something that wasn't broken, and what happened when 200 million people told them they were wrong. To understand why Coca-Cola did this, you have to understand the world they were living in. The 1970s and early 1980s were brutal for Coke. Pepsi had launched what they called the Pepsi Challenge, a nationwide series of blind taste tests held in shopping malls, stadiums, and public squares across America. Strangers were handed 2 unmarked cups. One contained Coke. One contained Pepsi. Pick your favorite. More people picked Pepsi. Pepsi turned the results into a national advertising campaign. The message was simple and devastating. If you actually taste them side by side, you prefer ours. It worked. Between 1979 and 1984, Pepsi's market share grew from 17.9% to 18.8%. Coke's dropped from 24.3% to 21.7%. In supermarkets, where there was no brand loyalty at the point of sale, Pepsi had already overtaken Coke entirely. The executives at Coca-Cola were watching this happen and panicking. For the first time in their 99-year history, they genuinely believed they might be losing. In 1983, Coca-Cola launched a secret internal project. They called it Project Kansas. The mission? Develop a new formula. A sweeter formula. One that could beat Pepsi in blind taste tests. The research team worked for nearly 2 years. They ran over 200,000 blind taste tests, one of the largest consumer research projects in corporate history. And they found something. The new formula won. Consistently. In blind tests across America, the sweeter, reformulated Coke beat both the original Coke and Pepsi. The numbers were unambiguous. The new formula scored higher, scientifically, statistically. CEO Roberto Goizueta was convinced. President Don Kao was convinced. The board was convinced. But the research team had made one catastrophic mistake. They never told the test subjects that the old Coke was going away. They tested preference. They never tested loss. There is a profound difference between asking someone which flavor they prefer in a sip test and asking them how they'd feel if you took away the thing they'd drunk every day of their lives. Coca-Cola measured the first question. They forgot to ask the second. On April 23, 1985, Coca-Cola held a press conference in New York City. Roberto Goizueta stood at the podium and made the announcement that would haunt the company for decades. Coca-Cola was changing its formula. The drink consumed over 7 billion times a day, in 155 countries, for 99 years, was being replaced. The new product would simply be called New Coke. The reaction was immediate, and it was not what Goizueta expected. Within 24 hours, Coca-Cola's switchboard was receiving 1,500 calls a day from furious customers. Within a week, it was 5,000. At its peak, 8,000 calls a day. The company set up a dedicated hotline. They hired psychiatrists to listen to the calls. One psychiatrist reported that some callers spoke about the formula change the way they spoke about the death of a family member. In Seattle, a man named Gay Mullins founded a group called the Old Cola Drinkers of America. Within weeks, he had 100,000 members. In Louisiana, a retired bottler named Roberto Ortega drove to every store within 50 miles of his home and bought every case of old Coke he could find. He spent over $1,000. A U.S. senator from Georgia, Coke's home state, called it a blatant attack on American culture. Pepsi declared victory. They ran full-page newspaper ads saying, "The other guy just blinked." They gave their employees a day off to celebrate. Coca-Cola had spent approximately $4 million developing the new formula. They had spent another $30 million on production, marketing, and the launch. In 79 days, it was effectively over. Sales of new Coke were not just disappointing, they were declining. Week by week. The taste tests had said people preferred it. The market said something entirely different. Here is what the research had missed. When people drink Coca-Cola, they don't just drink a liquid. They drink 1886. They drink their grandmother's kitchen. They drink summer afternoons and movie theaters and the first sip after a long day. Coca-Cola wasn't a product. It was a memory. And you cannot replace a memory with a sweeter formula, no matter what the blind taste test says. The executives at Coca-Cola understood this too late. Don Keough, the president, later said, "We knew some people were going to be unhappy. We didn't know we'd be talking about the death of a flavor like the death of a family member." By June 1985, internal research showed that only 30% of Americans liked new Coke. The stock price was under pressure. Bottlers, the independent companies that produced and distributed Coke worldwide, were furious. Some were threatening legal action. On July 10, 1985, exactly 79 days after the launch of new Coke, Roberto Goizueta walked back to the microphone. He announced that Coca-Cola Classic was returning. The original formula, unchanged, back on shelves. A BC News interrupted its afternoon soap opera programming to broadcast the announcement live. The U.S. Senate broke into a spontaneous round of applause when the news reached the chamber floor. Gay Mullins, founder of the Old Cola Drinkers of America, cried. Within weeks of Classic's return, Coke's sales surged past anything they had recorded before the crisis began. The outrage had converted into love. The near loss had reminded 200 million people how much they actually cared. Don Keough, speaking to the press, said something that became one of the most famous lines in business history. "We didn't plan it this way. But you can't say that, as we said all along, we love our customers, and they love us." Some people, including several journalists, immediately suspected it was all intentional. A calculated marketing stunt to reignite public passion for the brand. Coca-Cola denied it. Keough denied it. Goizueta denied it. But the result was undeniable. By the end of 1985, Coca-Cola Classic was outselling both New Coke and Pepsi combined. Here's the business lesson. And it's not the one most people take from this story. Most people say, "Don't mess with a winning formula." And that's true. But it's shallow. The deeper lesson is about what data can and cannot tell you. Coca-Cola ran 200,000 taste tests. They had more consumer research than almost any product launch in history, and they were still catastrophically wrong. Because the data measured preference, it couldn't measure identity. There are products people use, and there are products people are. Coca-Cola had spent 99 years becoming the second kind, and their own research couldn't see the difference. The second lesson is about the gap between what people say and what they feel. In a blind taste test, Pepsi won. In life, people chose Coke. Because life isn't a blind taste test. Context is everything. Emotion is everything. Brand is not what the product is, it's what the product means. And the final lesson, perhaps the most uncomfortable one. Sometimes the biggest threat to a great business isn't competition. It's the company's own belief that it needs to be fixed. Coca-Cola spent $30 million and 79 days learning something their customers had always known. That some things don't need to be better. They just need to be there. New Coke was quietly discontinued in 2002. You will not find it on any shelf today. Coca-Cola Classic? They eventually dropped the word classic because it became redundant. It was just Coke again. As it always had been. If you want the real stories behind the world's biggest brands, subscribe to Behind the Billions. New episode every week. Next episode. The company that said no to Netflix twice and paid for it with everything.